thank you, Claudia, and thank the Yreka Preservation Society for inviting me to come down and talk a bit about Shasta Indian tribe. That's really the subject tonight.
Please put your mic in front of your mouth.
Okay, you've got to tell me.
Real close. Real close, almost.
Right
Yeah.
there? How was that? Is that better? Just kiss it. Okay. Sometimes you get too close, it gets really loud.
Yeah.
I usually don't have trouble with volume, but I get in front of a number of people and I get quieter and more nervous, but this will help. Well, what I've come here today is to talk a bit about the Shasta tribe, some of the history of it, some of the prehistory of the Shasta people in Siskiyou County primarily, although the Shasta ranged from really Redding up to Wolf Creek by Eugene in Oregon, quite a large area. I'll talk a bit about that. So the first section here is going to be on sort of the history and prehistory of the Shasta people themselves. And the second thing I'll go into a bit is the transition period during the gold rush when my grandfather's great-grandfather met my grandfather's great-grandmother. She was full-blooded Shasta, and he was a Scotch-Irishman, a miner and a farmer on the forks of the South Fork of the Salmon River. Quite a history to that. In the last section, some current issues on what's facing the Indian nation now, the Shasta Nation as it's called. There are a number of councils that are formed in different areas trying to deal with a number of issues, primarily on land and water issues as well. That go back to 1851 when a treaty was signed. 13 chiefs came to Mugginsville in Scott Valley, and the government agents were going to different areas and signing treaties with a number of Indian tribes, trying to settle down a lot of the disputes that were going. So everybody signed that treaty, and of course the Civil War came along, so the treaty never was ratified. The Shasta people are not federally recognized as a group. But the Karuk tribe, living mainly in Happy Camp area, and very near the Shasta, were a lot more organized, let's say, or at least in the right place, and they actually picked up that treaty and managed to have it ratified and invited a lot of the Shasta people to be members of the Karuk tribe. That's the main reason that the Karuk have their recognition is because they were able to round up enough numbers of people in order to make it legitimate. And they still have their own festivals. It's quite an active group in a number of ways. So let's take a look at some of the slides. I brought a number of them. It's a lot easier to talk against slides than in general. The Shasta name has been talked about a lot, like where did the name come from? Because it's not a Shasta word at all, of course, like most terms, and many people have come to this country that have different names, or they were shortened to make them easier, or especially names that were difficult to pronounce were changed with a lot of families, of course. The traditional name for the Shasta tribe is Kutike Kanak. If you want to participate, you can. I thought I'd teach you a couple of Shasta words. I'm just trying to bring back some of the language myself because there's no books on it, but there are a number of people with a number, that do have a limited vocabulary. And there's a lot of Karuk words that are similar because there were a number of tribes in the area spoke the Hokan language, which has a lot of common words and sounds in it. So if you want to say Kutike Kanak, you just spoken Shasta, the first word. There's a number of names used for different areas that the Shasta lived in. The Shasta Valley, Ahotire, Salmon River, Konomihu, and we're pretty sure that's where my grandfather's great-grandmother came from, was Konomihu. Scott Valley area, Yreka, Klamath River, Kamatwa, the McLeod area, Okwanutu, and the Oregon area, Kahodate. There are several other areas with different names as well, but each group knew who they were. They all had a name, but of course when foreigners come to a new area, they say the Indians, the Shasta. And that's everyone was kind of grouped in that way. without getting into too much detail, if you look in the history of the contact period, when the, I call them the invaders, no, I don't mean any offense here, but the foreign invaders, came to the States, especially to the West, and with the intention of mining gold and taking over land, and a lot of the native people, of course, were there on the land. They had been there for 500 generations. It took 5 years to wipe out 3,000 people, leaving about 400, because the land they were on had gold on it. And the invaders figured the Indians, of course, were like animals. They looked like animals to them, at least. I'll show you a few pictures comparing traditional costumes of the native traditional Indian people and the invaders that came in. I don't know who scared more, who was scared more, because if you look at the costumes of the Europeans and the costumes of the regalia of the Indians, there's quite a striking difference. I do try to bring a little humor into it, although it was a very sad part of our history. The treaty was ratified in November 4th, 1851. Everybody thought things were going to be fine. It wasn't, it was signed, it wasn't ratified. So the government said, well, there's a few pieces of land there. We will let, in Shasta Valley, a few of the Indian people keep some of that land, because there were so many there, they couldn't get them out of there very well. But they did round up several hundred of the Shasta that were in the other areas, in the mountain areas, and all over, really, Northern California and parts of Oregon. And they marched them north to the Schantz Reservation in Oregon. It's now called the Confederate Tribes at Grand Round. There's 27 bands and 10 languages. Most people don't know about this because it's not in history books, but that was the Trail of Tears for the Shasta. Many of them died along the way because they were marched much like the Cherokee were marched from Oklahoma to Florida. And the purpose of them dying and starving on the way. It was a planned move. Again, one of the bad chapters in the history of that. There's a number of references, if you're interested. I've just listed a few here. One of the most important ones is the only book written by a Shasta Indian, by Betty Hall, called The Shasta Nation. There's not a lot of detailed information and text on it, but it does show a lot of the families. And of course, I'm proud that about a quarter of the book is on my ancestors and family from the Salmon River area. A couple of other books if you want to get more radical, depends on how upset you want to get. When the Great Spirit Died, it's quite a well-known book as well, talking about California generally, and the kinds of things that went on for the land grab. But like I tell a lot of my cousins, it was an invasion, and we were conquered. Get over it. It happened. It was bad. There was massacres and rapes and land grabs and water things and all that. But when a group of people move in, they have bigger guns. That's what's going to happen. A lot of those rights have been a lot of those wrongs many people have tried to make right. There were a lot of good people, and still are a lot of good people, working on an effort to revive some more language and amend some of the past. But in the 60s, they were trying to figure out how we're going to settle this land thing with the Indians, the populations, and the California government with the California Indian Legal Services settled on a very simple solutions. They gave all people on the rolls, including my family, 47 cents an acre for California land. And they said, that should be plenty, because that's what it was worth when you got here. And you weren't doing anything with it. You weren't polluting streams, you weren't smogging up our cities, you weren't killing the fish. Anyway, I'll get off my bandwagon. But there's a number of other good books, too. Dottie Theodoratus has a number of unpublished reports. She was a student of Alfred Kroeber, who wrote the Handbook on Indians of California. If you want to learn something about Indians of California, that was the first major document published out of Berkeley by Dr. Kroeber. Proud to say that Dottie was my graduate chairman in graduate school. Quite an amazing lady. And then Robert Heiser took over from Kroeber, and he recently retired. And then there's R.B. Dixon, and I won't go down the rest of the list, but Dixon was on the Huntington expedition in California, or all over actually the West, and spent 2 years trying to establish, where the name Shasta and Mount Shasta came from. That's where I get my reference from, because there's a lot of other people that have made reference to where the name Shasta and Mount Shasta came from. But Dixon pretty well points out that there was an old man, his name was Chief Shastika, or Chief Shasti, that lived on the foot of Mount Shasta. And everybody knew him in the area, and that's where the name was adopted from. A lot of the references in the literature talk about the Russian name for white, which is Shasti. They think that might have come out of there. I have a disagreement with a number of people that have written books on this, but it just depends on the perspective that you have. And a number of other books that have been written on it. Now, at the bottom of this list, Peter Ogden was in here. He was one of the first fur trappers that came out of Canada into Oregon and Northern California. And next slide, please.
Next slide, please.
If this man came into your neighborhood and you were, your village, what would you think? Looks like he was raised with colic or had it when he was a child. But this guy had beaten an Indian to death. He had 5 wives. His father was the Chief Justice in Canada, actually, and that was his kid. But they got him out of Canada so he wouldn't be hung for the things he was doing to Indian people. But he was one of the first guys that explorers and fur trappers to come into this area. And a lot of people give him credit for naming Mount Shasta. He said, yeah, that's Mount Shasta. So they wrote it all down, and people went on their way. If you want to read about him, he wrote a book, Traits of American Indian Life and Character. Right. You can imagine the perspective he had of the people and the things they did to him. Of course, when he named Mount Shasta, he was looking at Mount McLaughlin. If you look a little more in the literature, you see he had the wrong mountain. What did he name? Next slide, please. There's a number of other sources. The Siskiyou Pioneer from the Siskiyou County Historical Society. I really recommend, they publish a book each year, and they have really great stuff going back to 1946. I'm using a lot of the reference out of there in my research, but since 46, there's been at least 2 or 3 books a year, so I hope I live long enough just to read the books so I can write some more stuff that I'm working on as well. The best book on the Indian contact period was the 2009 version of the Siskiyou Pioneer. It has some excellent articles in there about the transition between Indians and the contact period. This is Indian Peggy. Just one example of so many stories that have come out of that period of time. Indian Peggy heard one day that her tribe around Yreka were getting together and they were going to go in and kill everybody in Yreka, wipe out all of these foreigners. Because a week before, 2 miners had raped and killed a young Indian woman outside of Yreka, and nobody did anything about it. And this happened many, many, many times. And they just got fed up with it. So they got all together to go there and hit Yreka the next day. And she went into Yreka on her own and told everyone, you better get out of here because you're going to get slaughtered. So the Yrekians at that time went into the caves that were underneath Yreka. All the gold mines, there were a lot of caves underneath the city at that time. So everybody ran and hid. So everybody, here comes the Indians, we're going to wipe out these white guys, and nobody was there. And they thought, oh, we must have scared them. They ran, and kind of left it alone. Of course, Indian Peggy's legend is there quite a bit. She was allowed to walk around town. She could take anything she wanted, and she was really revered. She's actually buried nearby. Quite a personality. And they asked her, they said, look, you're going to get beat up by the whites and by the Indians. And she said, I think they'll all understand after a bit that had I not done this, everybody would have died. She was able to foresee that. Quite a personality. Now, there's another thing that's unpublished by Wayne Bartley called Mom's Story. He's done an enormous amount of research, and it's sad he died a few years back from a heart attack. I think he got dug so far into our ancestry and saw what went on there. I think it really affected him. And quite a story about that. Next slide. And if you look around at different maps and stuff, it's interesting. You see that at the top of the map, the bluish part is the Shasta. They were quite a large tribe. And the Karuk were there, the Tolowa, the Yreka, Wintun were neighbors in the south. Of course, the Modocs and the Achumawe and the Wintun. The Modocs liked to go kick butt. You know, they raided everybody. Just Captain Jack, you may have read something, heard something about the Modocs. They just liked to fight. You know, they raided the Shasta quite a bit. Ironically, after Captain Jack was captured and most of that tribe wiped out, the same group of people came to the Shasta and they said, hey, can we be part of your tribe, call ourselves Shasta, because the soldiers are going to kill all of us if we don't. So the Modocs were actually adopted into the Shasta clan. Then many even consider them part of the Shastan group. It's just some maps here about the range of where people lived, the Shasta all the way down to Redding, all the way up into Oregon. Next slide. In this local area, the archaeologists have found 156 Shasta villages along the Scott River, Klamath River, Shasta River, all around the Yreka area that are still there. Now this is a picture of a traditional Shasta Indian. His name is Sergeant Sambo. His real name is Ake Ahumpe. That was his name. It's Ake Ahumpe. And they called him Sergeant Sambo. And I thought, why would he have that name? He actually died at 105 years old. He was one of the main informants for all of the anthropologists and the people keeping information. Quite a personality. I'm actually now working on, with a friend of mine, duplicating that dress. I do intend to dance in powwows, if I live long enough, with that dress, because there's no Shasta Indian dress ever represented in powwows. Just trying to bring back some of the color and the life that existed here for 500 centuries. And, you know, and people, 500 generations, the people just wanted to be left alone. You know, invaders came in and killed everybody. From an Indian perspective, it's drastic, and most people, of course, feel badly about that, not all. There's one other book you might be interested in. It's called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. If you haven't read a book on an Indian's perspective, I suggest you read that one, because that's about the Sioux and Rosebud and all went on to Sand Creek. But everybody has a little different perspective on history, of course. So this is Sergeant Sambo, as he's called, when he was a young man. He used to run around the forts and stuff, and so they, you know, instead of his Indian name, they gave him the name of Sergeant Sambo. So I thought, where did Sambo come from? And where did Sergeant come from? Well, his dad was named Sambo. I don't know what his dad's name is. I'm still looking for that. But because he was dark, the soldiers called him Sambo. And you can assume where that name came from, because he was dark. And his son was son of Sambo, or because the sergeants liked him so well, they called him Sergeant Sambo. That's how he got his name. Interesting part of history. Next slide. And you see some of the other regalia and costumes. You know, the Indian women, of course. It's not funny, but the men still talk a bit about it. But you know, the women cooked and took care of kids and set up tents and plank houses and cut up the fish and made the meals and took everything. And the men fished and hunted. They had a pretty good situation. They fished and hunted, and the women did everything else. Of course, that's the other way around now, but
Should be.
I don't know if women fish and hunt. No, I guess they do. Next slide. These couple of baskets that I have that were given to me by my grandmother and made back in the 1800s. See some of the basketry. Everyone knows about Indians make baskets, right? Well, made a lot of baskets. They're very intricate, very neat stuff. And they all had a function, and every design had a meaning to it. I spent a lot of time on this, but I got a lot more to talk about, so I've got to get through it. This is one of the few pictures. If you look in the middle there, right in the center, there's a woman carrying about a 200-pound load of wood on her back. Because women also carried wood for miles. It's was really amazed to find this in the archives. The only other group of people that I've seen do this is the Kikuyu women in East Africa. I spent some time in the Peace Corps in Kenya, and women on a regular basis will carry 200 to 300 pounds of pack on their back of wood, and she'll walk for 3 or 4 miles with that on her back without putting it down. I had a buddy that was really big, and he tried to pick the pack bunch of wood up. He couldn't get it up. You know, it took 2 people to put it on her back. And women actually die in childbirth because it so disforms their pelvis and all that from the wood. But the Kikuyu women are like the Shasta women. They just were worked like mad. Had to. Okay, here's another word for you. Yreka nune tuche wache.
Oh, man.
Yreka nune tuche wache. This is the name of Yreka. Really is the Shasta, the great spirit that lived on top of Mount Shasta. And its translation is to be walked around but never on top. The Shasta would never go on top of Mount Shasta because that's where Yreka, the spirit god, really the great spirit, lived. There's a whole story to that I won't go into, but whenever you had a dream or a vision, you know, or just, you know, feeling of closeness to the spirit, you would prepare yourself and go to Mount Shasta, camp there a few days, do your prayers, you know, talk to Yreka, and go home again. And you had to leave the site as you found it, you know, without, you know, burning down trees and leaving Coke bottles and stuff laying around. It had to be like you found it. Nobody ever went on top. And no one ever lived there because it was a sacred mountain. And many of the surrounding tribes also revered Yreka nune wache, tuche wache. Whenever Shasta would see the mountain, he'd wake up in the morning, if he'd see the mountain, he would say that word twice. You know, that was you know, good morning, God, twice. It's essentially, good morning, Great Spirit. Take care of me, you know, praise you, lands and animals and things that you have given us, and thank Him for that as well. It's all a connection, of course, between the spirit and the animals and the plants that everybody enjoyed. This is another picture of a traditional chief, called Chief Sunrise. Amazing, because he's got an interesting look on his face. I don't know much about the background. I'm still looking into it. The interesting thing about the picture is that he has an army vest on underneath his clothes. You can see the gold army buttons. And whether he borrowed that or somebody gave it to him or he took it is always a question, of course, because the Shasta did fight back to no avail. This is my grandfather's great-grandmother, Kate Sitit Shastika Jordan. A lot of story to it. Chief Shastika and his wife Blaze were living in the valley around Mount Shasta, and the invaders came. Of course, the men sent all the women and children to the mountains to keep them safe, and they fought the invaders. And there's different stories about it, but it appears that Chief Shastika was taken captive, taken to Fort Miller down by Fresno, and starved himself to death because he had given up hope. But Kate, anyhow, ran to the woods. She was 16 years old with her sister, Julia, and one of her cousins, Canyon Mary. And they were being chased by everyone. They were even grabbed by a group of Modocs, as the story goes. They got away from them and came onto this encampment, or this small area that Josiah Proctor Jordan, a miner and farmer, had established, had a little building there, and they ran into it, and they were being shot at, you know, by the local tribes, Indian groups, hunters, whatever they were, trying to capture these women. And the rest of it's history. I mean, Grandpa Jordan married Kate, and they had like 10 girls and 4 boys, and I've got a lot of cousins. I think I have 820 cousins at last count. But, well, that's Kate. Next slide. And this is Julie, her sister. She married a miller. Next slide. This is Canyon Mary. Always have trouble with this picture when you see the condition she's in. They built a fence around her house because she kept trying to run away. She had lost her mind for a number of reasons. Next slide. This is the family. In front is Kate, they call her Sunflower, and Josiah Jordan. The story behind him has got to be amazing. I reckon he's Scotch-Irish, but my Aunt Doris thinks he's probably English. I said, no. English didn't have the parties that this man had. They used to dance and really have some blowouts and well known in the community. And the Jordans were well known. Some of the daughters in the background and a husband there as well. It's not all the family, but quite well known in that area. So, it's kind of a log cabin. Of course, the people lived in the past. A couple of relatives in that picture as well. On the left here, in the back, the tall guy that we almost cut off the top of his head, his name is that's William Wolfert. His dad, George Wolfert, came in during with the miners and stuff, and had William, who married Kate. Who married Rosa, if you can believe that. On the left is Rosa Wolfert. She looks like right out of an English novel. And her sister to the right. It's interesting to see how the biology comes out in people, especially during the contact. Like some people don't look at all Indian or part of their heritage, and others do very much. Next slide. I could say a lot about this, but I have to keep going. That's Rosa on the right and the back when she was very young, just striking, the Indian women, especially with the East-West mix, if you will, and brought forward just really beautiful people. And that's Grandpa William Wolfert sitting down, and that's my grandpa, the little guy, sitting on his knee. Next slide. And that's Grandpa Frederick. That's who I was named after, and my grandma, Mamie Wolfert Moore. He died when Mom was 3 years old, so I never got to know him, but I was raised in his image. Everything I did, everything I said, everything I thought, was compared to him, because they figured I was a reincarnation in many ways. There's one tribe, actually it's the Kikuyu, again, in East Africa. They believe that the grandson is the grandfather. In fact, if your name is Mugo Gathero, your grandson will be called Gathero Mugo, because it's you all over again. That continues throughout generation after generation. I bring that name up because I came back to graduate school, and who was there teaching history? Mugo Gathero. A whole other story I won't go into. Next slide. This is Semu Huaute, the Chumash shaman.